Hello and welcome along. The Rangdan Xenocides. What were they and what impact did they have on the Imperium? So the Rangdan Xenocides were really a very long campaign that consisted of three major sub-campaigns within them, and they lasted across a period of around 50 years. It's hard to tell exactly when they started or finished, the dates are all over the place, but they do seem to roughly last 50 years. And they included huge numbers of Imperial forces. They constitute the greatest losses that the Imperium suffered before the Horus Heresy. They were considered the greatest threat to the Imperium before the Horus Heresy. And they were so large that they involved 9 Space Marine legions, huge numbers of Titans, Knight households, various Mechanicum forces numbering in the millions, millions of Imperial army and navy, the presence of at least 3 of the Primarchs, and the direct intervention of the Emperor himself, which was required to stop total disaster occurring and the entire northeast segment of the Imperium collapsing to these aliens. So it all started when an expeditionary fleet of Dark Angels discovered a world that had Xeno presence, shall we say. These Xenos became known as the Rangda. Now, being aliens, and they were obviously hostile, the Dark Angels immediately began purging them. And after a very difficult battle, they managed to defeat the aliens on this world and purge the planet of the Xeno. This was done at great cost. They lost about 5,000 Astartes in this campaign. Now, normally this in itself would go down as one of the major campaigns and major losses of a legion. However, this was just the very beginning. This was the tip of the iceberg. What had actually happened is the Dark Angel fleet had come upon an outpost of a vast alien empire and had thought that this was their homeworld. After a very intense and damaging battle, they had thought they had gained victory over this alien species, this new species they discovered and wiped out, because that's what you do when you're a Dark Angel and you find a new form of alien life. You immediately wipe it out and tell no one about it. So they did this thinking they had sort of snatched a victory from the jaws of defeat. But in fact, what they'd done is draw the attention of this powerful new enemy onto them and the Imperium. So soon, this enemy, the Rangda, would focus their effort on the Imperium and would launch a massive attack against the Imperial world's expeditionary fleets in the region. So this is the northeast region of the galaxy where largely the Dark Angels were operating at this time. However, there were elements of other legions around, and the White Scars and Raven Guard had elements in the region in expeditionary fleets. They took the brunt of these first counterattacks by the Rangda, and their fleets, through heroic efforts, eventually managed to fight off the Rangda, but took enormous losses themselves, something like 3,000 Astartes between them. That's not the hugest numbers compared to some of the numbers of what we get from the Horus Heresy, but at this time, that would be considered a major loss. And you've got to remember the legions were generally smaller at this time in the past. This is, roughly speaking, happening in the middle of the Great Crusade, and the legions hadn't grown to enormous numbers yet. And so a loss of 3,000 Astartes is going to be something that's considered a very severe loss. That, on top of already the Dark Angel suffering massive losses, meant that this alien species had to be taken very seriously. Now, they didn't stop there. They kept attacking. They were attacking anything they could come across, so overwhelming colonies, overwhelming garrisons, any fleets that they could come across, they were attacking and annihilating. So they were really swarming across this region of space, this sector. And the Imperium had to fight a war against them that was really a war of survival, not a war of conquest. So up to this point, the Imperium generally had the upper hand. It suffered some famous defeats on individual planets and so on, and various military disasters that happened across the Great Crusade. But this was different. This was a point where the Imperium actually potentially faced defeat for the first time on a wide scale, and a defeat that would leave them vulnerable to being wiped out. And so the Emperor's dream of a united galaxy under humanity would be impossible. And in fact, these Rangda looked like they could actually defeat the Imperium and take control of the galaxy. To fight off these Xenos, it required about 300,000 Astartes from 9 different legions, over 12 Titan legions. Now, you can imagine the power that a Titan legion contains. more than 12 Titan legions, many knight households. So a knight household or a Titan legion on its own is an enormous amount of power. That combined with the Imperial fleet forces, so massive numbers of starships, there's this enormous amount of firepower that was raised to fight these aliens. That and of course there would always be millions of Imperial army and Imperial navy and Mechanicum forces as well. Now, of course, the Astartes would be the tip of the spear, the elite fighting force within this massive Imperial army, but the sheer bulk and power that comes from all of these other allied forces is really what makes it so formidable. Now, it's hard to determine exactly who was in command of this force. We know that the Emperor did have to intervene himself personally to avoid disaster, but he doesn't seem to have been leading the campaign personally for most of the time. And in fact, we know that Horus wasn't present with the Lunar Wolves, and he was actually in the Galactic West at the time. And normally the Emperor is at this time is with Horus, so it's possible the Emperor was with Horus. We don't know, but he certainly turned up for at least part of it. The two Primarchs that were most prominent were Leman Russ and the Lion. So we know the Lion was very instrumental throughout the campaign. If you had to pick one person and say who was leading the campaign, it would be him. But Russ was present a lot as well, as both of their legions seemed to have been almost entirely present and were responsible for a large proportion of the fighting, particularly as the campaign went on. Doesn't seem to be any other Primarchs that were definitely there, except for one, which we'll come to shortly, but he doesn't seem to have had a large role in the leadership of the campaign. So after hurling enormous resources at this new enemy, the Imperial forces, largely under the leadership of the Lion, were able to gain the upper hand and managed to defeat this new enemy in open conflict and eliminate them as a direct threat for this time. This massive counterattack by the Randa and then the defeat of this attack is considered the second xenocide. The first one was just the initial meeting where the Dark Angels thought they had encountered a new species on just one world. That would be considered the first xenocide. Now, after the second xenocide, things went quiet for a bit, and they thought they had contained them, and they kind of basically the Imperium blockaded this region of space and said no one's allowed to go in there. It's dangerous. And so people were kept out. And now eventually the third Rangdan Xenocide would be launched. This seems to have been exclusively Space Wolves and Dark Angels taking part, led by their two Primarchs with seemingly the Lion in the lead. But however, what happened in this third Xenocide is quite unclear. It could have been either that by this time the Rangda were vulnerable, they had been largely defeated, and this was essentially a true Xenocide, essentially where they just went from planet to planet, found any remaining Randa and destroyed them, mostly from orbit, essentially just eliminating any trace of these aliens so that they could never come back, wiping them out from existence. And this is essentially the official Imperial history line. However, we know that the Imperial history is very unreliable, but also in this specific case, it's well known that the Dark Angels in particular erased huge amounts of the history of what happened at the Rangdan Xenocides, mainly because they suffered enormous losses, and that didn't look good on their legion's history, but also because they probably did some really, really terrible things, which is probably the next option and probably the most likely one, which is when they were exterminating these aliens, they exterminated huge numbers of humans as well. Now, the Rangda themselves were prone to enslaving humans. So one of the ways that they increased their military was by enslaving anybody they defeated. They would put control collars on their necks, and that would give them control over whoever they had captured, and then they could use them as soldiers. And they had their own soldiers as well, who had very advanced technology, were very powerful, and were believed to be one of the few cases where an alien force had a true match for an Astarte. This is one of the reasons why the Astartes suffered such huge losses, because they were coming up against such a very powerful and essentially an enemy that on an equal footing to them, or perhaps even slightly better. But on top of this, they had these vast hordes of slaves who would fight for them. Of any species they managed to defeat, they would enslave. Humans kind of seem to breed like rabbits in the 40k universe, and they're everywhere. So wherever you go, you find worlds full of humans. And wherever you go, you often find aliens enslaving humans. So it's a favourite pastime of the aliens of the 40k universe is to enslave humans and use them for all sorts of diabolical purposes, but one of which is to get them to fight against the Imperium. When the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves were exterminating the last remnants of the Rangda in this third campaign, they were almost certainly wiping out millions upon millions of humans who were on these worlds who'd been enslaved, and probably some who hadn't been enslaved, who were just fighting still against the Rangda. But they had decided that it was essentially necessary to take a kind of a scorched earth approach and just wipe out any life in this region. Because if you wipe out everything, then there's definitely no Xenos left. That's basically the policy of the Dark Angels in most circumstances. Obviously, the Lion had suffered huge losses. He felt that it was necessary to go to extreme lengths to make sure they wiped out this potential future enemy. Now, it's also reported in some sources that, in fact, the third xenocide was instigated by the Rangda again attacking. In fact, that they were not as badly defeated as they seemed after the second xenocide, and that they came back in force again and caused huge losses to the Imperium again, in particular killing about 50,000 Dark Angels. And this was a huge loss for any legion. And now, at this point, the Dark Angels were the largest legion. They were the first legion, of course. They were created first. They were increased in number first. They had led the bulk of the Great Crusade as the largest legion up until this point. And this seems like this was a turning point in their history where that they took such huge losses, took quite a hit to their prestige because of just how badly this campaign went and how many had died, that they kind of tipped over the edge of being the golden boys of the Imperium. It is believed that it is at this point that they go from being the largest legion to the Ultramarines becoming the largest legion, who would remain the largest legion from this point on, essentially. Now, it's also known that, as well as the Dark Angel, Space Wolves, White Scars, and Raven Guard, that the World Eaters were present in some number. We don't know exactly how many, and the Death Guard were certainly present in large numbers. Exactly what their roles in the campaign is hard to tell, but they were present. It's also likely that 3 other legions were there who add a little bit more intrigue to this, because the first one is the Alpha Legion. Now, officially, this campaign takes place some considerable time before the Alpha Legion are officially revealed to the public of the Imperium, and also before Alfarius himself is discovered officially. In fact, it seems to end about 50 to 60 years before either of these things happen. However, it is in fact believed that Alfarius himself was present during either the second or third xenocide, and that he appeared with his legion to offer help to the Lion on the grounds that the Lion was his preferred choice to become War Master at some point in the future. Obviously, he felt he was the right one for this, but he didn't like making bargains with people, so he turned Alfarius down. That's how the story goes, but of course it involves Alfarius and the Alpha Legion, so it could have happened, or it could not have happened. Who knows? So potentially Alfarius was there or not there. Potentially the Alpha Legion were there or not there. And potentially he offered the Lion help, or he didn't, and the Lion turned him down, or he didn't. I personally believe the Lion would have taken the help, because he is a pragmatist. They were obviously in great danger of losing, and they were taking huge losses. Why not take the help of one of the other legions, even if it is, a bargain that is to be struck? He's not like he's asking the Lion to give him anything. He's simply saying, I would prefer if you were the most prominent Primarch. Should we need one in the future to be in charge, I'd prefer it was you. That's not really a bargain that is it's not really anything that Lion is giving up here. So I think it's more likely that the Alpha Legion were involved and in a military capacity helping at some point during either the second or the third xenocide. Now, it's also said that that Alfarius was potentially in the area because he wanted to find Omegan, and there were rumours that Omegan was on one of these worlds, and that he did find him, and that he rescued him and wipes out the aliens on that world. So again, they could have found Omegan, or they may not have found Omegan, and if they did, if the Alpha Legion were there and Alfarius was there and he found Omegan, then this was a key moment in Imperial history where Alfarius and Omegan were reunited for the first time. Potentially none of this happened. Anyway, so now, even more intriguing than this is there were supposed to be 9 legions present. Now, I've listed all of those. except two, because those two were possibly and perhaps likely the Lost Legions, the 2nd and 11th Legion. We don't have names for them, obviously. And because that would make up to 9, and there is no record of the other legions that we know of being there, so it's quite possible that they were there. And that might be another reason why so many of the Imperial records were tampered with about this campaign, because they obviously were purged from history, and any campaign that they took place in is going to have to be heavily redacted so that nobody knows that they existed. And think about what a task that would be. Like, all Imperial history has to be purged from any hint that these other two legions existed, or that the two Primarchs of those legions existed. So that would actually all add up. So, and it does make a lot of sense. But obviously we can't confirm that. So what's the fallout from this incredible campaign, this potential enormous disaster for the Imperium, the point when they were most likely to fail in their campaign to expand across the galaxy and unite it under humanity? Well, the first thing obviously is the effect that it had on the Dark Angels and the Lion himself personally. So at this point, like I said, his legion were the top legion. They were the biggest legion. They had done the most. They've been around the longest. They were potentially the most trusted by the Emperor, and he, as their Primarch and as first Primarch, was clearly right up there as one of the very top, most influential military minds of the Imperium. But after this campaign, their numbers are massively reduced, and as we've said, they were overtaken by the Ultramarines. But more importantly, they were overtaken in the kind of leadership role by the Lunar Wolves. So the Lunar Wolves from this time on become the prime legion of the Imperium. And Horus really is elevated more than he was before, even though he was already very important to the Emperor. It's really this point where he becomes the obvious leader amongst the Primarchs. So his star rises while the Lions falls. Now, of course, you might think it's inevitable that he was going to become War Master in the future, but actually, I think it's fair to say that isn't really the case. He had a great head start because he was the first Primarch found, and he spent a lot of time with the Emperor before the other Primarchs turned up. But there was always a chance. The Emperor is not a sentimental person particularly, and he may well have at this point had the Lion earmarked to be the War Master at some point in the future, and that is perhaps the enormous disaster that befell the Dark Angels during this campaign, and the fact that Horus was completely divorced from it, in no way involved, doing some obviously probably great things on the western side of the galaxy, that Horus is then free of any taint that comes from this embarrassing episode in the Imperium's history. And I think that's a really interesting angle to put on this campaign. And maybe, obviously there's so much of this is lost to history, interfered with, changed. We know that there's much more probably happened there than is being revealed in the official history. But perhaps there's enough there to say, this was the moment when it was clear that it was Horus, not the Lion, that should be the potential future War Master in the Emperor's eyes. So let me know what you think in the comments. It'd be great to hear what your thoughts are on this. Were the 2nd and 11th Legion present? Were the Alpha Legion present? Did Horus find a Megan here? Did he try to make a bargain with the Lion? Did the Lion turn him down? Was this perhaps the moment that the Lion's star fell and that Horus rose to become the obvious candidate to be War Master? It'd be great to hear what you think. Like, subscribe and share. I will see you next time.